Oh, beloved, do you know what it means when the Spirit of the Lord chooses a resting place? Psalm 132 is not just ink on a page. It is a covenant cry, a sacred plea for the God of all eternity to make your household his dwelling. I can feel his presence even now as I speak of it. You see, when God rests upon a house, the ordinary walls turn into altars, the simple rooms become sanctuaries, and the air itself trembles with his glory. Many search for riches, for safety, for a name among men, but the greatest treasure is for the Lord to say, "This is my resting place forever, here I will dwell, for I have desired it." Oh, if only you could grasp what it means to have God's eyes upon your family, his Spirit breathing peace in your nights, his power securing your days. Tonight, as we pray Psalm 132 together, I tell you, heaven leans close and the eternal God is ready to rest upon your household. Psalm 132 is one of those sacred passages that pulls back the curtain on the covenant heart of God, and within its words, there is a divine invitation to cry out for his presence to rest upon the very place where we live, eat, laugh, weep, and raise our families. The covenant promise of Psalm 132 is not just about a temple in ancient Jerusalem. It is about the dwelling of God among his people. David, who longed to build a house for the Lord, carried a holy burden that stretched beyond stone walls and golden lampstands. His yearning was that the God of Israel would find rest in the midst of his chosen ones, and that longing still echoes today as an invitation for us to call upon God to inhabit our homes. When you read these words, you are not merely reciting ancient poetry. You are aligning yourself with the covenant cry that says, "Lord, find rest here. Let my household be the place you desire to dwell." This keynote centers around the recognition that the presence of God is the greatest covering a family could ever seek. To understand the covenant promise, one must look at the heart behind David's prayer. He vowed not to rest until he had found a resting place for the Almighty. That passion moved heaven, and God responded with a promise that he would indeed find a dwelling. The psalm is filled with declarations of God's choice, his desire, his decision to rest where his people welcome him. This is no small matter, for the creator of the universe does not rest just anywhere. He looks for a place of invitation, a place where his name is honored, a place where his covenant is remembered. The covenant promise of Psalm 132 carries with it the assurance that when you call on him sincerely and open the doors of your household to his Spirit, he will not turn away. He will rest where he is desired, and his rest will bring blessing upon generations. This covenant promise is not a casual thing. It is deeply tied to the nature of God's faithfulness. In Psalm 132, God affirms that he will bless abundantly, clothe his priests with salvation, and cause joy to spring forth where his presence rests. That is the very heartbeat of the covenant, blessing tied to his nearness, salvation woven into the fabric of daily life, and joy flowing like a river through the halls of the home. These promises are not reserved for some distant people. They are made alive through prayer when a believer takes Psalm 132 upon their lips and declares it over their household. The covenant transforms into a living reality, and suddenly the dining room table becomes an altar, the bedroom a place of rest filled with peace, and the front door a gate guarded by angelic presence. The covenant promise of Psalm 132 is also generational. David sought a resting place for God, and in return, God promised that the throne of David would not lack a descendant. The presence of God is not meant to be a fleeting moment. It is meant to be a legacy. When you pray this psalm over your household, you are not only seeking God's rest for today, you are securing his presence for your children and your children's children. Every generation that walks under the covering of this covenant becomes a testimony of God's faithfulness. The blessings do not fade with time. They deepen and multiply as the presence of God continues to abide. This covenant is also a shield. The presence of God resting upon a household does what locks and gates cannot. It builds a fortress in the unseen realm. The covenant keeps chaos at bay. It drives away fear. It silences the whispers of the enemy. And it ensures that the family lives under divine order rather than human anxiety. The covenant presence is like a banner waving over the home, announcing to every spirit that this household belongs to God Almighty. That awareness brings peace even in the storm, strength even in weakness, and provision even in lack. To pray Psalm 132 is to stand in the same spiritual posture as David, saying, Lord, do not rest until you rest here. It is a daring prayer of hospitality to the Spirit of God, one that demands surrender, consecration, and unwavering trust. It is the cry of a heart that knows there is no greater treasure than to have God himself dwell within the family circle. And when that covenant prayer rises from sincere lips, heaven responds, and the promise of Psalm 132 becomes more than words on a page. It becomes the living, breathing presence of God in the very atmosphere of the household. When the presence of God chooses to rest upon a household, something supernatural takes place that cannot be explained by mere human understanding. An ordinary home made of bricks, wood, or stone suddenly becomes more than just a structure where people live. It becomes a dwelling place of the Most High. The transformation is not about physical beauty or wealth, but about spiritual atmosphere. A small room can hold more glory than a palace if the Lord chooses it as his resting place. Psalm 132 reminds us that God looks for hearts and homes that long for him, and when he finds that openness, his Spirit descends in a way that changes everything. It is not simply about religion being practiced within four walls. It is about the invisible yet undeniable weight of his presence filling every corner. Children who grow up in such an environment sense peace they cannot describe. Guests who walk through the door feel comfort that words cannot capture. And family members themselves begin to notice that their home feels different from the rest of the world. That difference is the resting presence of God. And once it abides, the household will never be the same. This transformation occurs because God does not come to visit. He comes to dwell. Many people experience temporary touches of God in church services, revival meetings, or moments of worship. But what Psalm 132 calls us into is something far greater, the Lord making a home within our home. When he rests upon a household, it means that the family has created an altar not of stone, but of daily surrender, worship, and prayer. It means that the rhythms of the home are no longer dictated solely by schedules and routines, but by the awareness that every action, every word, and every decision takes place before the eyes of the Holy One. This awareness changes how family members treat one another, how they handle conflict, and how they steward the blessings of life. The Spirit of God resting upon the household becomes the unseen teacher, correcting attitudes, inspiring acts of kindness, and bringing unity where there was once strife. The transformation is also seen in the way the household interacts with the world outside. A family where God dwells cannot help but radiate something that draws others in. The resting presence of God becomes a testimony that others notice even without it being spoken. Neighbors see the stability, visitors sense the peace, and those passing through are impacted in ways they may not even articulate. It is as though the home itself becomes a lamp set upon a hill, quietly shining the reality of God's kingdom in the midst of a darkened world. This witness is powerful not because of human effort, but because of divine presence. The resting of God upon a household makes that home a beacon, a place where weary souls find comfort, and where the fragrance of Christ lingers long after someone has left. Another aspect of this transformation is the way it redefines protection. When God rests upon a household, his presence becomes a shield stronger than any alarm system, a fortress greater than any wall. Spiritual battles that once tormented the family begin to lose their grip, and peace begins to rule instead of fear. Nightmares flee, anxiety lessens, and oppression cannot stand, for where God rests, the enemy cannot remain. The transformation is not only internal but external, shifting the very boundaries of the family's spiritual territory. The atmosphere changes so dramatically that it becomes evident to anyone who steps foot inside that the home is covered by divine protection. This transformation also manifests in provision. Where the Lord rests, lack begins to dissolve and his abundance begins to flow. It may not always come in the form of material wealth, but it always comes in the form of sufficiency. Needs are met in surprising ways, doors open where there were once walls, and resources flow in alignment with heaven's will. The household that carries God's presence finds itself walking in a supernatural rhythm of provision because the one who owns everything has chosen to rest there. This does not mean that challenges disappear, but It does mean that solutions and breakthroughs come in ways that testify to the hand of God at work. The transformation of a household by God's resting presence is also deeply personal. Each member of the family begins to encounter God in their own way within the walls of their home. Parents find new wisdom in raising their children. Children grow up with sensitivity to the Spirit, and relationships that were once fractured begin to heal. Arguments that once lasted for days lose their power because forgiveness begins to flow more freely. The presence of God resting upon the homes makes reconciliation possible. It softens hearts, and it draws family members closer not only to Him, but to one another. It is in this atmosphere that families thrive, not because everything is perfect, but because God Himself is present in the imperfection. Psalm 132 calls us to desire this kind of transformation, to pray until our households are no longer ordinary shelters, but sacred dwelling places. When God rests upon a home, it becomes a sanctuary, a refuge, a place where His glory can be encountered in the simplest of daily activities. It is the fulfillment of a covenant promise and the beginning of a legacy that will shape generations. When the Lord rests upon a household, the blessings and protection that flow are beyond what human effort could ever achieve. Psalm 132 reveals a pattern when God chooses a dwelling place. He brings with Him abundance, joy, salvation, and divine security. These blessings are not abstract ideas, but living realities that touch every aspect of family life. The psalm declares that God will clothe His priests with salvation and cause the saints to shout for joy, and that promise extends to every home that becomes His resting place. The blessings begin first within the Spirit, transforming hearts with peace and contentment, and then they manifest outwardly in the tangible realities of daily life. Families that once struggled under the weight of fear or confusion begin to experience clarity and stability. Where there was lack, provision begins to flow. Where there was sorrow, joy breaks forth. These blessings are not fleeting moments, but lasting fruits of His abiding presence. The protection that comes with God's resting presence is equally profound. A household that welcomes His Spirit becomes a fortress in the unseen realm. Demonic forces that once had influence find themselves unable to penetrate the atmosphere of divine covering. The enemy may attempt to attack, but his weapons lose their power where the Lord has chosen to dwell. This is not a passive kind of protection. It is an active shield, a consuming fire that surrounds the household. Night terrors, generational curses, and cycles of oppression are broken when God makes a home in the midst of His people. The peace that comes is not the absence of problems, but the assurance of divine protection that carries the family through every trial. This protection is not only for the present moment, but extends into the future, ensuring that the generations to come walk under the same covering of safety. The blessings that flow from God's resting presence touch every dimension of the household. Spiritually, there is a depth of intimacy with Him that begins to flourish. Prayer becomes easier, worship becomes sweeter, and the Word comes alive in fresh ways. Emotionally, the members of the household begin to experience healing. Wounds of the past lose their sting, forgiveness begins to flow more freely, and love becomes the atmosphere in which everyone thrives. Physically, there is strength and restoration, as God's presence often brings health and renewal. Even financially, the household begins to see the hand of God opening doors of opportunity and providing resources in ways that defy natural explanation. Every part of life comes under the blessing because every part of the home is under His rest. These blessings are not earned through human effort, but received through invitation and consecration. When a family prays Psalm 132 sincerely, they are inviting the King of Glory to step into the very center of their home. That invitation shifts the atmosphere and makes room for blessings to flow. God delights to dwell where He is wanted, and His delight always manifests in tangible goodness. The abundance that He brings is not limited to material things, but encompasses every form of provision needed for the family to thrive. Joy flows like a river. Peace becomes the unshakable foundation, and strength rises in the midst of weakness. The protection that comes with His presence also creates a sense of stability that the world cannot offer. While others may be shaken by the storms of life, the household where God rests remains steady because its foundation is secure. The storms may rage outside, but inside there is calm, for the Lord himself is the anchor. This protection ensures that no weapon formed against the family will prosper, and every tongue that rises against them will be silenced. The authority of the covenant rests upon the home, making it clear that this family belongs to the Lord and is under his divine care. The blessings and protection of God's presence also carry a generational impact. Children raised in an atmosphere of divine rest carry that awareness into their own futures. They learn to trust in God's provision, to walk in his protection, and to expect his blessings to follow them. The presence of God resting upon a household becomes the seed of a legacy, one that ensures that even when parents are gone, their children and grandchildren continue to reap the benefits. The home becomes a testimony of what it means for God to dwell among his people, and that testimony echoes into future generations as a living witness of his faithfulness. When God rests upon a household, the blessings and protection that flow are not limited to the family alone, but spill out into the community. Neighbors notice the peace, visitors feel the joy, and even those who pass by sense something different. The home becomes a beacon of hope, a refuge for those who are weary, and a place where the light of God shines brightly. It becomes evidence of his kingdom on earth, a small glimpse of heaven's reality manifested within the walls of an ordinary dwelling. The blessings and protection are not for display, but for impact, drawing others to hunger for the same presence that rests upon that family. The connection between humility, consecration, and God's decision to rest upon a family is one of the most profound truths revealed in Psalm 132. God does not rest where pride reigns, nor does he make his dwelling in a place that exalts self above his spirit. His presence seeks humility, for humility creates the atmosphere where his glory can settle without resistance. When a family humbles themselves before the Lord, acknowledging their dependence on him for every breath, every meal, every decision, they make room for his spirit to inhabit their home. Humility is not weakness. It is strength under submission. It is the recognition that we are not the builders of our own destinies, but rather vessels of his will. When a household collectively chooses to walk in humility, it becomes the kind of place that God desires to call his resting place, for it mirrors the very heart of Christ, who humbled himself even to the point of the cross. Consecration deepens this connection. To consecrate a household is to set it apart for the Lord, to declare that every room, every possession, every moment belongs to him. This is not a one-time act, but a continual posture of surrender. Consecration means that the television does not control the atmosphere of the home, but worship does. It means that conversations are guarded, that strife is resisted, and that prayer becomes as natural as breathing. A consecrated home does not have to be perfect, but it does have to be yielded. Families that consecrate themselves may not have riches or status, but they have something greater, a dwelling place for the King of Glory. The consecration of a home is like placing a seal upon it that says, "This house belongs to the Lord," and in response, God chooses to dwell where his ownership is honored. There is a divine mystery in how humility and consecration together prepare a place for God's rest. Humility empties the vessel, while consecration sets it apart. Humility says, "We cannot live without you," and consecration says, "We will not live without you." When these two qualities converge, the home becomes irresistible to the presence of God. This is why David's vow in Psalm 132 carried such weight. He refused to rest until he had prepared a place for the Lord. His humility acknowledged his dependence, and his consecration dedicated his efforts to God alone. Families today can walk in the same pattern by creating space for God not only in their words but in their lifestyles. A humble and consecrated home becomes a resting place that heaven delights to fill. The connection also reveals why many households struggle to experience the abiding presence of God, where pride is entertained, where bitterness is allowed to linger, or where compromise dominates. The Spirit of God cannot rest. He may visit, but he will not dwell where he is not honored. This truth calls families to examine themselves, to let go of the pride that blocks his presence, and to embrace the consecration that invites him in. It is not about creating a show of holiness, but about living in authentic surrender. A family that kneels together in humility and dedicates their home in consecration will find that God responds with joy, saying, "This is my resting place forever." Humility and consecration also open the door to blessings that cannot be gained by striving. A humble home attracts the favor of God because he resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. A consecrated home enjoys divine order because everything is aligned under his lordship. Together, these qualities create stability, unity, and peace. Arguments lose their power when humility softens hearts, and distractions lose their grip when consecration keeps the focus on God. The Spirit does not compete for space. He rests where he is welcomed. That is why the family that prioritizes humility and consecration will find their household transformed into a sanctuary, where God's presence is not a visitor but a resident. Generationally, this connection leaves a lasting imprint. Children raised in a home where humility is modeled and consecration is practiced grow up with a deep awareness of God's presence. They learn early that pride destroys, but humility builds, that compromise distracts, but consecration anchors. These lessons become the foundation of their own walk with God, ensuring that his presence continues to rest not only upon their childhood home, but also upon the families they one day lead. The legacy of humility and consecration stretches far beyond one generation, creating a ripple effect of God's rest flowing through the lineage. The decision of God to rest upon a family is not random, but deeply tied to the posture of their hearts. A home that chooses humility over pride and consecration over compromise positions itself under the shadow of the Almighty. God delights to dwell in such places, for they reflect his kingdom values. The home becomes a sanctuary, the family becomes a testimony, and the atmosphere becomes charged with his glory. This connection is not merely theological, but deeply practical, as every act of humility and every choice of consecration paves the way for his Spirit without hindrance. The generational impact of God's presence abiding in a household is one of the most powerful truths revealed in Psalm 132. When the Lord chooses to rest upon a family, the effects of his presence are not limited to the immediate moment, but stretch far into the future, touching children, grandchildren, and generations yet unborn. David's longing to build a resting place for God resulted in a covenant promise that extended to his descendants, ensuring that his lineage would be marked by the favor and presence of God. This principle reveals that when a family welcomes God into their home and cultivates an atmosphere where his Spirit can dwell, they are not only shaping their present reality, but also setting in motion a spiritual legacy that will influence their bloodline for decades and even centuries to come. The abiding presence of God becomes the inheritance that children carry, shaping their choices, their faith, and their destiny. Generational impact begins with spiritual formation. Children who grow up in a household where prayer is prioritized, where worship fills the atmosphere, and where the word of God is honored develop a spiritual sensitivity that cannot easily be erased. Even if they stray, the foundation laid in their upbringing continues to call them back to the presence they once knew. The peace they experienced in their childhood home becomes a reference point for their adult lives, drawing them to seek the same abiding presence in their own households. The influence of God's presence leaves imprints on their souls, guiding them in ways that surpass human instruction. A parent may teach lessons with words, but the atmosphere of God's rest teaches through experience, embedding a deep awareness of his reality that endures long after they leave the home. This generational impact is also seen in the breaking of cycles. Families often carry generational patterns of sin, addiction, poverty, or brokenness. But when God rests upon a household, those cycles are interrupted and destroyed. The presence of the Lord creates a new lineage, one marked by freedom, blessing, and favor. What may have plagued parents and grandparents can be cut off as the Spirit of God establishes a new standard of holiness and righteousness in the family. This means that children and grandchildren are not destined to repeat the mistakes of the past, but are empowered to walk in the liberty of the Spirit. The abiding presence of God shifts the narrative, rewriting the story of the family line with grace and redemption. The blessings of God's presence also extend into generational provision. Just as David's covenant with God brought promises for his descendants, so too does a family that hosts his presence open the door for provision that outlasts them. This provision may come in spiritual wealth, in wisdom, in divine protection, or in material resources that sustain future generations. When God rests upon a home, he establishes a legacy of abundance that flows from one generation to another. Children inherit not only physical assets, but the spiritual atmosphere of favor that makes room for them in the world. Grandchildren reap blessings from prayers prayed long before they were born, and great-grandchildren walk under the covering of covenants established by their ancestors. Generational impact is also reflected in the testimony carried forward. Families that live under the abiding presence of God become living witnesses of his faithfulness. Stories are told of answered prayers, miracles experienced, and seasons where God's hand carried them through. These testimonies inspire faith in younger generations and remind them that the God of their fathers and mothers is also their God. The heritage of faith becomes an anchor, ensuring that the knowledge of God is not forgotten but passed down through lived experience. The household becomes a living memorial, much like the stones set up by Joshua in the Jordan River, declaring to future generations that God is faithful and his presence is real. The generational impact also manifests in leadership and influence. Children raised under the covering of God's presence often rise to positions of influence where they carry the fragrance of his spirit into their communities, workplaces, and nations. The household becomes a training ground for kingdom ambassadors, and the presence of God prepares them for assignments that extend far beyond the family walls. The generational impact is not confined to the family line, but spills over into society, as those shaped by God's rest upon their household carry his presence wherever they go. Ultimately, the abiding presence of God in a household ensures that the family becomes more than a collection of individuals living under one roof. It becomes a covenant lineage, a testimony of God's faithfulness, and a channel through which his glory is revealed from one generation to another. The impact stretches into eternity, for when God rests upon a family, he weaves their story into his divine plan, ensuring that their influence endures long after their earthly lives are complete. How praying Psalm 132 aligns your heart and home with God's eternal desire to dwell among his people is a truth that carries both intimacy and majesty. When this psalm is lifted in prayer, it is not just words spoken into the air. It is a declaration that connects the human heart with the eternal purposes of God. Psalm 132 is unique because it intertwines the longing of David with the response of God, showing that when a person or a family hungers for his presence, heaven answers with a promise of rest and abiding glory. To pray this psalm is to place your household into that sacred alignment, saying, Lord, this is not just my house. This is your house. Let this be your resting place. That alignment is not one-sided. It opens the family to God's eternal plan, while at the same time fulfilling his deep desire to dwell with his people. Praying Psalm 132 shifts the focus of the home from being centered on human ambitions to being centered on God's presence. Many households are filled with prayers for provision, success, or safety, and while these are important, Psalm 132 teaches us to go deeper. It invites families to pray not only for what God can give, but for who God is to dwell among them. When this psalm is prayed sincerely, the heart begins to desire his presence above material wealth, his favor above human recognition, and his nearness above every temporary comfort. This alignment reshapes priorities, creating a home where every decision, every plan, and every pursuit is filtered through the question, does this invite God to rest here? The alignment also creates a rhythm of worship within the household. Psalm 132 points to the dwelling place of God, where his priests are clothed with righteousness and his saints sing for joy. Praying it over a household transforms daily life into acts of worship. Conversations shift, conflicts are approached with forgiveness, and routines become infused with awareness of his presence. This is not about rigid rituals, but about living with a consciousness that the King of Glory resides within the walls of the home. The psalm becomes a framework for cultivating joy, thanksgiving, and reverence until the entire household begins to echo the atmosphere of heaven. Praying Psalm 132 also aligns the family with divine protection and provision. The words of the psalm declare God's promises to bless abundantly, satisfy the poor, and clothe his people with salvation. When a family prays this psalm, they are not only claiming those promises, but placing themselves under the covenantal order in which those promises flow. God desires to bless, protect, and provide for his people, and Psalm 132 teaches us to pray in agreement with that desire. This alignment ensures that the home becomes a place where provision flows naturally, where protection is felt tangibly, and where salvation becomes the covering for every member. Another dimension of this alignment is how it connects the household to God's eternal story. Psalm 132 speaks of God's covenant with David, promising that his descendants would sit upon the throne. When families pray this psalm, they are linking themselves to that covenantal narrative, declaring that their home will be part of God's kingdom purposes. This means that the family is no longer living only for their own survival or advancement, but for participation in the larger story of God dwelling among his people. This alignment gives meaning to daily struggles and victories alike, because they are seen not as isolated events, but as part of God's unfolding plan. Praying Psalm 122 also fosters generational alignment. When parents pray these words, children hear them, and the longing for God's presence is planted in their hearts. The household becomes not just a place where God is invited for the present moment, but where a generational covenant is being established. This ensures that long after the parents are gone, their children and grandchildren continue to walk in the alignment that was prayed into the atmosphere of the home. Psalm 132 becomes the legacy that frames the family line, ensuring that the desire for God's presence does not die with one generation, but flows like a river through many. This alignment also carries an evangelistic power. A home where Psalm 132 is prayed regularly begins to radiate something outward. Visitors sense the peace, neighbors notice the stability, and friends who enter the home encounter a presence they cannot explain. The alignment with God's eternal desire makes the household not only a sanctuary for the family, but a lighthouse for the community. Prayer transforms the atmosphere until the home itself becomes a testimony that God's presence is real and his rest is possible even in a chaotic world. To pray Psalm 132 is to surrender the ownership of the household back to God and to welcome his eternal will into the present reality. It creates alignment where human frailty meets divine faithfulness, where earthly homes become sanctuaries, and where families step into the flow of God's eternal plan. This alignment is not fleeting, it is covenantal, and it ensures that the presence of God will not only visit but remain, resting upon the household as both promise and fulfillment.